I'm really sorry we have such a strict, tight schedule, and I have to move on immediately to Shaimaa. And Damian, it would be great if you stayed around for Shaimaa, because Shaimaa wrote one of my favorite articles that we had in the online symposia that preceded this conference on the securitization of gender struggles in the war on terror. So I don't see Shaimaa on the screen yet, but I'm sure she will pop up any second.
Oh,
Hi, Shaimaa. So this
yeah.
is Shaimaa Abdelkarim. Shaimaa is a lecturer in post-colonial legal theory and critical race studies at Birmingham Law School. Her research concerns questions on resistance, coloniality, and human rights. And I'll hand over to Shaimaa.
Thank you, Marlene. So my talk offers a critical reflection on feminist approaches to international law and the representation of third world women in these approaches, and specifically during the manifestation of the war on terror in shaping gender struggles. So mainstream international legal work have mobilized and meshed, I would say, the security crisis after 9/11 with the crisis of sexual violence that came with the salvationist narrative around saving third world women from regressive communities. Now, the recent work of Karen Engel, Vasudha Nisaya, and Diane Otto suggests that the securitization of gender struggles on an international level is not necessarily a product of 9/11. Rather, the international legal framework, and specifically that of Security Council Resolution 1325, and more generally the Women, Peace, Security Agenda, precedes 9/11 by a year. As you may know, the Security Council resolution was a product of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and was commended for calling for women's participation in humanitarian efforts. The resolution itself is a mixture of empowering frameworks but it's also coupled with addressing sexual violence by strengthening state carceral and punitive mechanisms. So what the security crisis did is that the securitization of gender struggles really thrived with the war on terror, with the shifting from a human rights framework to a national security one. Now, international securitization approaches to violations of human rights have also affected national enforcement through mobilizing state responsibility and state resources like that of investigations, prosecutions, and punishment to combat sexual violence. The reliance on carceral systems have limited feminist mobilizations to the reproduction of state relations. As Mimi E. Kim argues, calls for criminalization and incarceration like that through special police and court units for sexual assaults and strict laws against gender violence has transformed the feminist subject to an agent of the state. Carceral feminism, which is a term that is coined a strand of feminist mobilizations that restrains feminist work within a reformist and state-centered punitive measures and restricts civil society's work, while also framing feminist struggles within a salvationist rhetoric. Now, carceral and international conflict feminism also builds on the idea of a global or shared sisterhood. So the move from the local initiatives to a transcendental shared global space happens in a reductionist ways on what gets globalized. The idea of a global sisterhood tackles a common problem that assumes that the stereotypes that follow women are all the same, even if they're different. It assumes that all women have the same position, which diverts attention from the violence of interventionist strategies under the guise of saving women. Now, Black feminist contributions have dealt with the limitations of the global sisterhood through first understanding the interrelated forms of oppression with an awareness of how our social agencies are constructed within our social realities. Second, they have recognized how the state and international institutions, including the criminal justice system, is a primary institution in perpetuating violence. And third, they've turned towards community-led initiatives and social mobilizations for emancipatory potential. And the term here does not redeem the role of the state, but it's built on something outside of those power structures that are carceral. So what I mean by community-led initiative is not a supplementary to welfare programs, for example, but action that understands the role of the state and its violence. Black feminist contributions helps us unpack the limitations of the securitization of gender struggles on an international and global level that still operates within the framework of women in need of protection, while universalizing women's experiences in conflict zones to account for all experience. An example of that is the use of feminist critique of the public and private divide in counterterrorism feminism. Now, counterterrorism feminists mobilize the critique of the divide to allow for a broader interpretation of state responsibility in investigating private terrorist activities, or more ambitiously, they deconstruct the public and private dichotomy in defining the scope of state responsibility for private action so that any arena of conflict becomes equated to an arena of counterterrorism. As Chaudhry argues, this is eased through the malleability of the responsibility to protect doctrine and blurring the lines between human rights rhetorics within CEDAW and humanitarian interventions in women, peace, and security agenda. Now, if you look closely, specifically at the representation of third world women within the securitization of gender struggles, we get to see that all success stories of feminist mobilizations on international level revolve around framing third world women as agentless victims. This is not a new narrative, but rather a manifestation of colonial practices that co-opts women's voices to justify the use of violence and quashing anti-colonial mobilizations. An example of that is the use of unveiling of Algerian women during the French-led demonstration in May 1958 to quash anti-colonial resistance. The event was a performative and well-choreographed ceremony, as Marina Lazark describes it, that shows the obsession with third world women in the colonial glaze, and specifically the veil that becomes the symbol of oppression. And by stripping it, women are free to enter into civility. Fast forward to 2002 with the infamous Laura Bush speech, in which she equates the US-led invasion of Afghanistan and its fight against terrorism to a war on the rights and dignity of women. Now, both incidents show a peculiar representation of third world women in which they are agentless, but they can be led to liberation. It is a form of representation that produces an image of third world women in terms of their object status, as Mohantni argues. Such object status only accounts for third world women, how third world women are affected by the system, unaccounting for their basis of action and feminist mobilizations that defy the salvationist rhetoric, like the plethora of feminist mobilizations in Afghanistan on a local and global level. An interrogation of the representation of third world women require an active form of suspicion on how international legal frameworks, specifically within the women, peace, and security agenda, constructs its victory stories in relation to the oppression of third world women's voices. This interrogation requires unpacking the assumption that the category women is a coherent and universal one, and question the assumption that all women's struggles are the same. We start to unpack the normative reference that homogenizes women's oppressions under a specific set of women's experiences during armed conflict, while neglecting various other experiences that address colonial and imperial legacies in shaping contemporary racial and gender struggles. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Shaimaa. Oh God, okay. I wish you could have seen how aggressively I was nodding the entire time you were talking. I really enjoyed this. So again, sadly, no time for questions, but if you have questions for Shaimaa or would like to get in touch with her, maybe Shaimaa, you can share contact details?
Oh yes, so my email is s.abdelkarim, you can see the name on somewhere on the screen, at BAM, so BHAM.ac.uk, or you can just Google my name and you'll find my institutional email.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wish I could say that the two of you should stay and join the workshop, but sadly the workshop is going to be in German. So I'm very sorry, I'm going to switch into German now. I'm also speaking to the screen as if you can see me.